Good day, everyone. Today we will be discussing the introduction to aquaculture. Particularly, we will be focusing our discussions on the four major classifications of aquaculture, as well as the milestones on the development of aquaculture and the comparison between aquaculture versus the capture fisheries. So, technically, the major part of our discussions for today will be focusing on as I've said, on the four major classifications of aquaculture. First is the classification of aquaculture according to the aquatic environment, and the second classification will be according to the species cultivated, and the third classification will deal on the structures utilized for aquaculture, and the last classification, as a major classification of aquaculture, is the culture systems employed for the aquaculture endeavor of a certain aquaculturist. So before anything else, I hope that everybody have already responded to the pretest that I have posted in our Google Classroom, which is a 10-item true or false. So that will set a measure for me and how am I going to approach this particular discussion and this particular module. So, going back to our discussion, as a form of introducing the word aquaculture, basically, let's first take a look at the definition according to the Food and Agriculture Organization. So, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, the definition of aquaculture is basically a farming of aquatic organisms in inland and coastal areas, involving interventions in the rearing process to enhance the production and the individual or corporate ownership of the stock being cultivated. So, meaning to say, this is just a farming. Like in the terrestrial farming, the aquaculture is aquatic farming involving aquatic organisms, may it be either a mollusk, crustaceans, finfish, or aquatic plants, maybe, and in either inlands using different culture structures like fish ponds and fish tanks, and also in coastal areas and even in the open water areas, especially that we have already now the advanced structures that will tolerate the open areas. So this is aquaculture according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, involves the intervention of rearing process. So rearing process meaning to say from the different stages of aquaculture stocks to in order for us to enhance the production. May it be either the production is owned by an individual or owned by corporate, or there is a cooperative involved for the cultivation. Aquaculture is also defined according to the RA 8550, otherwise known as the Philippine Fisheries Code, as the fishery operations involving all forms of raising and culturing fish and other fishery species in the fresh, brackish, and marine water areas. So later on, we will be discussing further what are these fresh, brackish, and marine water areas, and what are the different fishery species that are commonly cultivated in these areas, and what are the structures utilized. So I hope that the definition of aquaculture from these two definitions is already clear. And looking at the comparison between aquaculture and capture fisheries, we could say that the main difference is that in aquaculture, there is an ownership of the stock, while in the capture fisheries, there is, or the capture or the gathering of aquatic resources is from their wild state. So technically, aquaculture is again the intervention in the rearing process to enhance the production, such as regular stocking, feeding, and protection from predators and many others. While the capture fisheries is basically just the harvest of organisms which are exploitable by public as a common property resources with or without appropriate licenses. So when you're capturing or gathering aquatic resources from their wild state, that's considered as the capture fisheries. But when you own or when you stock a certain organism in an enclosure, or maybe any body of water wherein you own, and you introduce or you enhance the production through feeding, regular stocking, protection from predators, and many others, you are engaging the aquaculture. So I hope that's already clear between the capture and aquaculture. So, as I've said earlier, we will be classifying aquaculture to according to the four general classifications of aquaculture, mainly according to the aquatic environment and according to the species cultured, as well as according to the structures utilized, and lastly, the classification of aquaculture according to the culture systems being employed. So let's first take a look at the aquatic environment. So technically, the aquatic environment is mainly subdivided into four. Um, First off is the freshwater aquaculture, the brackish water aquaculture, the marine water aquaculture, and the aqua silviculture. Pardon me for this arrangement of my slides because this is supposedly been animated. But I have already posted the slides in our Google Classroom. You can take a look at that. And according to the aquatic environment, mainly the difference between these four, the freshwater, the brackish water, and the mariculture, as well as the aquasilviculture, is mainly defined or mainly varied according to the salinity. Now, what is salinity? Salinity is basically just the total amount of solid material in grams contained in 1 kilogram of seawater. Now, if you take a look at the salinity of the freshwater, wherein most of the freshwater finfish species like tilapia and mudfish, catfish are being cultured, it normally has less than 0.5 parts per thousand of salinity. And most of these aquacultures are being employed in aquaculture environments such as rivers, ponds, and rice paddies. Now, if we take a look at the salinity level for the brackish water aquaculture, it normally would fall between zero point 0.5 to 30 parts per thousand, right? So again, the PPT stands for the salinity, which is the total amount of solid material in grams contained in 1 kilogram of water. So technically, the brackish water has a very wide range of salinity in the culture system context in according to the aquatic environment. So we could consider this as the most wide or euryhaline type of aquaculture classification. Now, the next one is the mariculture or the marine water aquaculture, wherein the salinity falls with an average of 35 ppt, and most of the areas that are normally employed this particular mariculture systems are in coves and bays where there is an adjacent land masses between these particular structures. So 35 ppt is the average salinity for the mariculture. And we also have this what we so called as the aqua silviculture, wherein the salinity falls between 3 to 27 ppt. The aqua silviculture is basically just the culture of any organism, any aquatic organism within the mangrove areas. As long as you're not harming the mangrove areas, you're not cutting the mangrove areas, and you are culturing or rearing perhaps crabs or bangus maybe, you are already engaging in aqua silviculture. So those are the four sub-classifications of aquaculture according to aquatic environment. Now let's proceed to the next classification, which is the species cultured. The normally the most of the commodities being cultured in aquaculture involves finfish, crustaceans, seaweeds, mollusks, and many others. And in each of the particular subclassifications has different commodities being cultured. So what are these finfish? What are these crustaceans, and what are these seaweed, and what are those mollusks? So finfish basically are are the most dominant um, cultured or dominant commodity in aquaculture industry, involving the culture of milkfish, tilapia, and catfish in the Philippines. And crustaceans, with regards to the crustaceans, these are basically just um, organisms with exoskeletons. And part of the aquaculture commodity involving crustaceans aquaculture are shrimp, prawn, mud crabs, lobster, and some other crustaceans being cultivated. And also, aquaculture is also classified according to the species cultured into a seaweed aquaculture. So normally, all of the aquatic plants in the aquaculture industry falls under the seaweed aquaculture, wherein they normally cultivate green seaweed, brown seaweed, and other types of seaweeds. And there are also commodities which involves the cultivation of mollusks such as the oyster cultivations, the mussel cultivations, and abalone cultivations. So this is the second classification of aquaculture according to the species cultured. And let's proceed to the next one, which is the structures utilized. The structures utilized in normally in the aquaculture may be either in the freshwater, in the brackish water, or in the aqua silviculture, or even in the marine water varies differently depending on the site requirements or the location requirements for aquaculture. So most of the land-based facility for aquaculture is fish pond. Fish pond is defined as the land-based facility enclosed in earthen or stone material to impound water for growing fish. And the second one is fish tank. It is basically just a concrete or a fiberglass type of enclosure that allow the aquaculturists to exert a relatively high degree of environmental control over parameters. So technically, these are all land-based facility. The fish pond and the fish tanks are land-based facility for aquaculture, and it could both be used for either freshwater, brackish water, or marine water. And for the other one, the other structures being utilized for aquaculture is this fish cage. Normally, fish cage is defined as an enclosure which is either stationary or floating, made up of nets or screens sewn or fastened together and installed in the water and held by a place with various types of anchors and boats, so floats rather. So this particular aquaculture is normally being employed for mariculture industries. In fact, there are already advanced or high-tech fish cages that are being adopted by aquaculturists, like the Norwegian floating mariculture or the Norwegian floating fish cage, wherein it could tolerate typhoons or even storm surge nga that are tolerable to this particular facility. And the other one is the fish pen. It is an artificial enclosure within the body of water for culturing aquatic resources made up of poles closely arranged in an enclosure with wooden materials, screen or nylon netting to prevent the escape of fish. So technically, the difference between fish cage and a fish pen is that the fish cage could either be floating or totally submerged. The fish pen will just do not have the netting bottom. It does just utilize the seafloor or the coastal flooring, and the ones that being used for an enclosure are just the nettings and poles to enclose the aquaculture commodity that is being cultivated. So that's the third. And the last one is the culture system or the stocking density. So basically, this is the major or one of the most major classifications of aquaculture. The three: the extensive aquaculture, the semi-intensive aquaculture, and the intensive aquaculture. These three could be identified or could be distinguished according to the stocking density. Normally, extensive aquaculture will have a stocking density of 5,000 per hectare. the semi-intensive aquaculture will have a range of 10,000 to 15,000 per hectare of stocking density, and the intensive aquaculture will have more than 15,000 per hectare, depending on the type of species being cultivated and depending on the amount of inputs being added in that particular culture system. Now, if you take a look at the culture system versus the management procedures that are being adopted in these three systems, we could see here in this figure that the extensive aquaculture will have more dependent into the natural food organism. So technically, extensive aquaculture will have a very uh, few to no inputs of artificial feeds or other inputs from the farmers. And if you take a look at the semi-intensive, it starts to decline. The dependency of natural food organisms starts to decline for semi-intensive, and the stocking density starts to increase. It has now a bit of a wider or broader area for stocking density, as well as the inputs of artificial feeds. So normally semi-intensive will be supplemented with artificial feeds apart from the inputs from the natural food organisms. And if you take a look at the intensive aquaculture, normally it will have the highest stocking density among the three. Now, normally intensive aquaculture were not very reliant to natural food organisms. In fact, it does not really need the natural food growing as a only source of food. In fact, it will be needing the artificial feeds for the growth of the aquaculture commodity being cultivated. So this is basically the diagram, the illustration that basically explains the culture system and the management context for this particular classification of aquaculture. Now here we have the shrimp culture systems as an example between the extensive, semi-intensive, and intensive according to the pond size, stocking density, feed, pond preparation, water management, gate system, and the production per hectare per year. So normally, the extensive aquaculture will have 2 to 20 hectares as a pond size. So normally it is a very vast or wide area for extensive aquaculture, since you will be needing the growth of natural food organisms as a primary source of food for extensive. So normally you will need a very vast or wide areas. Semi-intensive will have at least 1 to 5 hectares. So supplemental feeding will be employed in this one. Intensive aquaculture will have a pond size of 1,000 meter square to 1 hectare. So that's basically the main difference between the three according to pond size. Now, if we take a look at the stocking density, again, it will basically, for the shrimp aquaculture, it will have 1,000 to 10,000 pieces per hectare, and for semi-intensive, it will have 30,000 to 100,000 pieces per hectare. And for the intensive, it will cater for at least or at 100,000 hectares in the intensive aquaculture with regards to the stocking density of shrimp. Now, if you take a look at the difference between these three culture systems according to the feed, as I've said, the extensive aquaculture will be employing or depending on the natural food organisms, while the semi-intensive will be employing the supplementary feeding in addition to the natural food available in the pond or in any enclosure. The intensive aquaculture will just uh, rely on the formulated diets or the artificial diets being supplemented or being employed in that particular facility. So that's the difference. Another difference according to the feeds for the shrimp culture systems. Now another, we could also classify the extensive, semi-intensive, and intensive of the shrimp culture systems according to the pond preparation. So if you're employing extensive aquaculture, you will be needing the growth of natural food organisms. Same goes with the semi-intensive aquaculture systems. But in the intensive aquaculture system, you do not allow or you do not basically need to grow a natural food. You just need to condition the soil or the bottom of the pond culture systems. So that's primarily the difference. And then with regards to the water management, for extensive aquaculture does only rely on the tidal fluctuation, while the semi-intensive will rely in both tidal fluctuation and the pump, and the intensive aquaculture with regards to the water management will rely on the pump and artificial aeration, normally with paddle wheels and some sort of um, aerator devices or even blowers. Now, if we take a look at the gate system in this tree, only the extensive aquaculture system will have a single gate system, while the semi-intensive and intensive aquaculture will have a double gate systems. And then with regards to the production per hectare per year, normally extensive aquaculture will produce 100 to 600 kilograms per hectare per year, while the semi-intensive will have 600 to 4,000 kilograms per hectare per year, and then intensive will have at least 5,000 to 15,000 kilograms per hectare per year. So those are the four major classifications of aquaculture according to the ecosystems or the environmental requirements, the species cultivated, the structures utilized, as well as the culture systems being employed. Now let's proceed to the milestones in aquaculture development. So here we have a very brief description of the milestones in aquaculture here in this diagram. So aquaculture started around 2000 to 1000 BC, wherein the earliest aquaculture was started in China, and they wherein they cultivated the common carp, scientifically known as Cyprinus carpio. So that's around 2000 to 1000 BC. And in the 500 BC, Fanley wrote the literature about the classic of fish culture. So basically, there are already methods or at least literatures involving the classic uh, fish culture. And then in the 618 to 906 AD, this was the time of Tang Dynasty in China, wherein it's just so happened that the emperor was named after the carp, and it resulted to the ban of cultivation for carps, and it resulted also to the introduction of new species because the emperor banned the cultivation of this carp since it the emperor named Li is basically just a common name for carp uh, in the previous. And then here we have the 906 to 1900s AD. It was in the Song Dynasty wherein there was already a systematic fry collection in the areas, and they already know when to gather the fry and what season to gather in that particular species. So they already have the knowledge on that particular aspect of aquaculture milestone. And then in 1368 to 1644, it was in the Ming Dynasty wherein there was already a complete aquaculture methods. No, there were already methods in cultivating fry, rearing eggs, and so on and so forth. And then in the 1644 to 1911, it continued in the Qing Dynasty that there were detailed descriptions of the fish culture and methods. So technically, this was just a continuation from the previous milestone. And then in the 1900s to 1970, the aquaculture have already expanded worldwide, and there were already breakthrough in the seed production produced in captivity. So it was in 1900s to 1970, and from 1970 to present, it continued to expand. And there were already interventions on selective breeding, selective culture, and the cultivation of high value species, exportable species, and intensification of aquaculture basically is already being employed due to high demand of these aquaculture commodities. So all in all, those are the milestones of aquaculture development. So if you have questions, you could just revisit, because I'll be posting this video in the BS Fisheries Professor YouTube channel at this link. You can follow this link and subscribe and like for notifications once there will be new videos to be posted. And once again, thank you very much for joining, and I hope to see you again in our next lecture. So, thank you.